So you want to tell a story with FTL travel. Maybe you're going for something more grounded in science than stuff like slip space and hyperspeed. Or maybe you just want to set yourself a bit apart from the crowd. In either case, Alcubierre Warp might be the way to do that. In this video, we'll be looking at what this form of FTL is, how a warp spaceship would be designed, and what implications this has for a science fiction setting. First, a couple quick disclaimers. This warp drive is almost nothing like the warp drive from Star Trek. Star Trek came out before the theory was even conceived, so understandably they got a number of things wrong. Second, I am not a theoretical physicist, so chances are I might get a few things incorrect in this video. If you are familiar with the subject, make sure to comment down below with additional details or corrections you have for this subject matter. With that out of the way, let's get into it. The warp drive, originally conceived by theoretical physicist Miguel Alcubierre in 1994, is a hypothetical means of faster-than-light propulsion created to get around the universe's speed limit, the speed of light, which is also known as c. No object with mass is capable of traveling at or higher than c. Space, on the other hand, can. While we often think about space as a flat plane, in reality, space is something that can bend, that can move, and thanks to observing the expansion of the universe, we know that it can move rapidly. A warp drive exploits this property of space to travel faster than light. By creating a region of extreme spatial contraction in front of the ship, and extreme expansion behind the ship, one can create a spatial structure known as a warp bubble, with an area of flat space-time inside. This allows the ship to effectively travel at or above c relative to the space around the bubble, while technically being at a standstill, so not violating the speed of light. This theory, however, has some interesting complications that are relevant to a storyteller. First, it requires the existence of negative energy density, or a state of density lower than that of a vacuum. This is required to create the expansive part of the bubble, and can only be created by exotic matter that has negative mass, or a mechanism that can produce a similar effect with positive energy. This exotic matter would essentially act as fuel for the warp drive, though it is unclear whether it actually gets used up in the process. That can be decided by you, the writer. If in your setting the exotic matter does get used up, it isn't inconceivable that between trips the ships might refuel their warp drives at orbital gas stations or dockyards. These would become vital infrastructure for any established colony, with the smaller colonies importing exotic matter for their stations and larger ones refining it in orbit themselves. These refineries would then become major targets in any interstellar conflict. If you damage the manufacturing and storage facilities, you could seriously hamper your enemy's ability to move around. Even if the exotic matter isn't used up while warping, it would still be a vital strategic resource that would affect how many ships a faction could build at any given time. In either case, you could see interstellar wars and offensives over controlling major refineries, such as how oil is fought over in the real world. Another challenge any spacefaring civilization must overcome is the energy requirements. No matter how you slice it, creating a warp bubble is hard. So hard, in fact, that in the original metric, it theorized it would take more energy than exists in the entire universe in order to create one. Modern estimates have rounded down that number to merely the energy you would obtain from converting about 700 kilograms of mass into pure energy. That's a lot, by the way. Essentially, any faction investing in warp travel must be capable of generating significant amounts of energy. This amount of energy can be reduced, however. For example, one method for decreasing the energy required is to increase the thickness of the bubble itself. However, this comes at the cost of speed. A ship that deploys a thicker warp bubble will move slower relative to the outside world, but require less energy, while a ship that uses a thinner bubble would move much faster but require a much greater power source. In this way, how fast a faction can travel is basically limited by the energy they can produce. So civilizations with more advanced reactors could run circles around a less advanced one. There are also a few major implications that a warp drive has. For traveling faster than light, the bubble will create large amounts of Hawking radiation, so some way of protecting the ship inside is a must. The bubble also cannot be controlled once initiated, so all trips have to be calculated and prepared ahead of activating the drive. Once you turn it on, there is no way to change whatever course you've plotted. Most ships would probably check the calculations multiple times to make sure nothing is incorrect. Now, into how it is designed. What would a warp-capable spaceship look like? Luckily, for the most part, this can be up to your imagination. Once a faction is capable of creating warp bubbles, virtually anything that can fit inside the bubble can be transported. Whether you're into the sleek or gigantic look of ships like the Federation's, or the blocky utilitarian designs like the UNSC's, your ships can be, for the most part, anything you want. Except for one thing. See, in order to safely create the warp bubble, the ship's drive has to be projected from a ring-like structure around the vessel. If it were projected from inside the ship, like in most sci-fi settings, any fluctuation or problem could cause the field to make contact with the ship and tear it apart, which is not good for crew health and safety. This means that all warp-capable ships must have this ring, and that the diameter of the ring has to be larger than the rest of the ship. The size of this ring relative to the ship also affects the energy requirements of the warp drive. A larger ring relative to the ship, for example, uses much less energy than a ship with a smaller ring. However, it isn't as simple as creating the largest ring possible around a ship. A larger ring requires more materials for one, and also poses more of a target for asteroid strikes or hostile ships. A ship designer has to balance these two competing needs when creating a ship's warp ring, trying to find the smallest ring they can create given the reactor output they have to work with. This also means that more advanced civilizations would usually have smaller warp rings than more primitive civilizations. Now that ship design is out of the way, we can start to figure out how the effect itself would look visually. Since it is theoretical, there is a lot of room for artistic license, but there are a few things I've been able to piece together. First, while in transit, the crew of the ship would be unable to see anything outside the warp bubble. Since the ship is traveling so fast, any visible light would be blue shifted into the ultraviolet spectrum and X-rays. Meanwhile, infrared and microwaves would become visible light at times, so all you'd be able to see is essentially a fluctuating blue plane. When entering warp, one interpretation of the bubble's activation is that it might, emphasis on might here, look as if a black hole is formed in front of the ship due to the extreme contraction of space. The only real information I could find on this part is from Quora and Reddit, so there were a lot of conflicting interpretations. I would say this part is probably just up to however you want it to look. Exiting warp, on the other hand, is a totally different story. Since space is not empty, while traveling, your spaceship will run into a lot of small particles and radiation. Most of these will simply be warped around the bubble, along with the spacetime it inhabits, but some of these particles will get trapped in the field and carried to the ship's destination. When the ship comes to a stop, all of this collected matter will be released forward as radiation and high-speed particles. This creates a bright visual effect I've dubbed a warp flash. This warp flash effectively shotguns anything directly in front of it with these particles and radiation. So don't exit warp too close to anything you don't want to destroy. In addition, this warp flash would be visible across entire solar systems and possibly even from neighboring stars. This has some serious implications for a military setting. When you exit warp, Your location and arrival is broadcasted to everyone looking in the right direction. Stealth arrivals are basically out the window. Unless you're careful and warp in behind a star or planet to hide yourself, the arriving fleet can expect a response very quickly. This also means that any civilization with the resources will invest a lot into observation posts around important planets, designed to watch the sky for warp flashes and report contacts to their superiors. Combined, all of this comes together to create a lot of interesting opportunities for world building and visual design. Best of all, it is all grounded in at least some degree of real science, because the Alcubierre Warp Drive is not fictional. It is a scientific theory, and one so compelling that agencies like NASA are spending real resources researching it. It's possible that in the near future we might even have a working model for it, which will either validate or disprove most of the stuff in this video. In the meantime, however, the Warp Drive is prime for storytelling with a lot of ideas to explore. First, the Warp Drive is a theoretical method of manipulating space-time that allows the ship to technically travel faster than light without violating general relativity. Second, warp drives require exotic matter to operate. Exotic matter would be a resource of significant strategic importance, akin to oil, and the infrastructure to create it would be extremely valuable to trade and warfare. Third, ships would require a lot of energy to operate a warp drive. A faction/ship's technology, and therefore how much power it can generate, has a major effect on things like how fast the ship can warp and how that ship is designed. Fourth, exiting warp would create an energy burst known as a warp flash in front of the ship. This can be extremely destructive at close ranges and can be seen from extremely far away, making it sensor arrays and early warning systems important for defending a planet. With all of this in mind, you should be well equipped to use this form of warp in your science fiction setting. I will see you all Starside. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Starside. If you have another topic you want me to cover, make sure to comment down below and it may just become my next video. If you're interested in more, make sure to hit like and subscribe. Anyway, have a great rest of your day.